Mother's Day is May the 14th, and so is our baby dedications and baptisms. We have an information night and potluck supper at 6 p.m. on May the 2nd. Spaces are limited, so if you want to sign up, come and see me at the newsstand or email me at nancy@lakeviewchurch.com.
If anybody here loves literature and books like I do, or you know what? Actually, even if you just didn't sleep totally through grade 10 English, or if you have like a pretentious poet friend, you know who John Donne is. John Donne is one of the most famous poets in the English language, wrote some of the best lines in our language. He was a poet and a preacher in the 17th century in England, and some of his most profound work came out of the Black Plague, this pandemic that was killing thousands and thousands of people in England. And so John Donne was writing and preaching in London in that time, and he actually came down with the plague himself. And he spent months in hospital. And so here he was, spending months in hospital, nearly dying. And all he could do was watch actually his body and watch the way it responded to the sickness. And he saw that as his body would go through these cycles and as it would get sicker, he gained this huge respect for this system that God had created, because he saw that as he got sicker, his body had these visible signs to show him that an invisible danger was coming, right? There was things that could be measured, his pulse, his temperature, his fluids, his blood, to know that something was coming, and so it could be treated before it was too late. Now, as he laid there, he had these amazing insights into then also the physical body. Not just the physical body, but into the spiritual body. And he wrote this brilliant passage on comparing our physical body with our spiritual body. And he said, actually, in many ways, our physical bodies are smarter than we are spiritually, than our souls. Because when our souls are sick, they don't even seem to know it. The body can measure things, but the soul can't measure. It just seems to carry on when it's sick, and maybe even getting less aware the worse the sickness becomes. And John wrote this. He said, I fall sick of sin, and I'm bedded and bedrid, buried and putrefied in the practice of sin. And all this while, I have no presage, no pulse, no sense of my sickness. I never see the fever of lust, of envy, of ambition. And the first notice my soul has of her sickness is irrecoverableness. And then he goes on and he cries to God for like a spiritual health check, a tangible kind of warning system that could show him when his soul was going down the wrong path, away from God, before it was too late and led to separation. And he said, God, if maybe you did give me one, but if you did, then I've figured out how to ignore it and how to deceive myself. And he begged God. He said, give me something more to keep me on the right path. Now, we live in a world that's obsessed with physical health, right? With monitoring and controlling our physical health. We've got monitors and measures strapped and attached to all kinds of parts of ourselves, to counting steps and counting calories and measuring sleep cycles and checking how we're doing. So we get something of this. But Donne was asking, what if we took that same zeal, that energy? What if we felt the same way about measuring our spirit as we do physically? What I'm trying to say is, the amazing thing is, as we're going through these letters of 1 John, I realize that that's actually in so many ways what John is giving us. Now the letter writer, John, not John Donne, what he's giving us in the 2nd chapter. He knows, just like John Donne says, it is very possible for us to deceive ourselves and to wander off track without ever realizing it, and going along thinking we're living our lives walking with God, when actually we're walking away from God. And so because John loves his people in the community that he's building in the 1st century, he writes this letter. And you'll see, he doesn't mix his words, right? John's very clear, and he gives us actually a very clear series of guidelines on how to check spiritually. How are we doing? And to get us back on the path that leads to life. Let's read it. Here's what he says. He says, we know that we have come to know him if we keep his commands. Whoever says, I know him, but does not do what he commands, is a liar. And the truth is not in that person. But if anyone obeys his word, love for God is truly made complete in them. This is how we know we are in him. Whoever claims to live in him must live as Jesus did. Dear friends, I'm not writing you a new command, but an old one, which you've had since the beginning. This old command is the message you've heard. Yet I am writing you a new command. Its truth is seen in him and in you, because the darkness is passing and the true light is already shining. Anyone who claims to be in the light but hates a brother or sister is still in the darkness. Anyone who loves their brother and sister lives in the light, and there is nothing in them to make them stumble. But anyone who hates a brother or sister is in the darkness and walks around in the darkness. They do not know where they are going because the darkness has blinded them. I was basically born into my faith. I didn't share the deep concerns of Mr. Dunn about whether something might be off with it or not, because when you're born into a churchy family or a churchy community or culture, it's basically kind of assumed that you're inheriting everything you need to know. And you do inherit a lot, right? You inherit a basic picture of what the Christian life could look like, and you just sort of take it on and assume it, and it becomes your measuring stick. And for me, that included some basics: make sure I believed all the right things, make sure I was in church every Sunday, praying morning and night on your knees, ideally would if possible, and other things too, right? Volunteerism, being kind, generosity. And there was this picture that I just assumed as long as I could keep that up, that I was a good Christian, right? That I'd go to heaven, that I'd spend my eternity welcomed by Jesus, and that was how I lived. And I encountered one day, and I don't remember exactly where I was or what was happening, but I do remember the feeling. I encountered these words from Jesus in Matthew. He says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who's in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles?' Then I will tell them plainly, 'I never knew you.'" It's a shock. It was one of the first times I ever honestly and sincerely was confronted with the reality that on the map of my faith life, I might not be where I thought I was. I might actually be lost, and worse, lost without even knowing it. I'd always just assumed, right? Check the boxes. And suddenly I realized, maybe I have a blind spot. And looking back on it now, I thank God for that awakening. I mean, it's a process, right? And I still spend half my time wandering around like I'm half asleep spiritually. But I am waking up to the truth that so much of my life and my faith are just motions and habits that I've picked up, maybe from family, from culture, and they need to get examined and checked. It's important. And often I need help from somebody outside of me to see what I just can't see. Because my instinct is to avoid this, right? Every time something in me opens up and gets exposed, it's vulnerable places, and sometimes it hurts a little. But the truth is, God does not ever expose us to condemn us. It's always that we might turn and be healed. He doesn't want us to hear those words, "I never knew you." So in that spirit, this morning, of being examined for the purpose of healing, we're going to jump into John's spiritual health check, his spiritual health check challenge, let's call it, together. And I encourage you, as you come with me, open your heart and let his word examine you. Here's where it starts. Once you know Jesus, John is saying, you will act like him, and you will love. This is called obedience. And if you're seeking to live a life of love, seeking to live the Christ life that maybe you've glimpsed somewhere, the one that Jesus lived, the only way to get it is as the outflow of a deep and profound knowing and relationship with Jesus. John's saying relationship and obedience are connected, inseparable. They have to be found together, so you can't have one without the other. And it always starts with the relationship first. The obedience is the outflow. It never goes the other way. The doing and the following of commands does not earn you the relationship. So the obedience is there, but it can't earn you the relationship. But it isn't a true relationship if it's not marked by obedience. Both things are true. And this is the first relationship health check that John gives us. We can know God. And we can know that we know God because we obey him. And our lives become like Jesus. And because we love. John describes in this passage our relationship with Jesus using a verb, right? A verb's an action word. In Greek, the verb is gnosko. Now in English, that's translated as to know or knowing, which is actually an unfortunate translation because to us it's about as lame of a verb, of an action word as you can possibly get, right? Knowing. Knowing. For us, knowing, it's about the mind. Just the mind. It's facts. It's information in getting to know about something. And it's unfortunate because in the world of the Bible, the sense of knowing, gnosko, is so much more than that. Maybe the best example, right, is in the Old Testament. In the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the same word is used to show the intimacy between Adam and Eve. Genesis 4, it says, Adam knew Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain. And in the New Testament, again, Joseph knew Mary not until she had given birth to a son. It's not just a euphemism for sex in the Bible, but it's used all over the Bible, actually. And everywhere it is, it carries this very full and complete sense of meaning. It's like a full experience of something or somebody and an understanding of them. It includes the mind, but the mind is just the beginning. But in our cultural context, right, this is where we can get tripped up. We value thought above every other way of knowing something. And we inherited this, right? Our culture, what does it say? I think, and it's because I think that I can therefore say that I am. And so we lose, when we hear these words, we lose the rich sense of fullness and even intimacy that the Bible means when it calls us to know Jesus. This doesn't start with us. As the early church was first finding its way and trying to figure out how to live this life of Jesus and how to have a relationship with Jesus, one of the first major threats to the church that's recorded, one of the first major threats to the faith is called Gnosticism. It's taken from this word, gnosko, because the whole threat was about this, saying that the most important thing is knowing up here. The rest, it's not spiritual, so it's not that important. And it's recorded throughout all the early church history that the early church fathers knew this was such a threat that it could destroy the church. Because this idea that you can know up here without the total participation of every other part of your life, every other sense of yourself, could lead to disaster. It sets us on a road that doesn't just not take us to Jesus. It doesn't put us on a road that doesn't just sort of get us there slowly. It actually sets us on a road that takes us away from Jesus. And this is the kind of knowing that Paul's talking about in 1 Corinthians 8 when he says, that knowledge, it puffs up. It makes you arrogant. It builds up yourself in your pride. And that takes you directly away from Jesus. So the early church saw the effects of it then, and of course, we see it too now, right? That you can know everything about Jesus. You can know a lot without actually knowing him at all. Same word. We can know everything about the truth and who he is without having even a hint of the fragrance of Christ in our lives. James said, faith without works is dead. So the life of faith that's only an intellectual belief or a knowledge of the faith, even if that truth is right, it's dead. We've all seen it in others. If we're honest, we see it in ourselves sometimes too. Because it's what naturally happens when we confuse knowing about Jesus with actually knowing him, without experiencing him. When we keep him up here, when we keep him out of certain areas of our lives, right? Or have parts of our lives that we don't offer up to him or open up to him, we say, oh, as long as I keep my basic faith, it's okay if these areas sort of stay separate from God and I never change or let him in there. But of course, that faith has no life. And John says, if that's you, then you can know you're just scratching the surface of knowing him. And there's good news. The good news is for you, there's more. There's so much more available. There's more for you to know about him. So what do you do with that? When each of us has this realization, and it does happen to all of us, to greater or lesser degrees, when we have this realization, what do we do? How do we get to know him more? honestly, it's a very hard thing to talk about because it's so relational and so personal that there's just no general formula for it. It's hard to find words to explain it. It's a hard thing to teach. And that's how a lot of things are actually in the spiritual life, right? There's just things that can't be taught. They can only sort of be like caught, you know? So how do we catch them? Mostly it's experience. We taste and we see that it's good. But what we can do is we can learn from the experiences of others too, right? We can catch, that's the closest next thing, is the people who walk along beside us or the people who've gone ahead of us. Not to copy them, but to catch the spirit of how they do it and to learn and be inspired from them. For me, Mother Teresa is an incredible model. Not because she's perfect, but she's an amazing model and a witness to the connection between this deep relationship of prayer and life with Christ and how it immediately results in this amazing outflow and outpouring of love. So I look to her for her relationship to see what is life with Christ and what does her model of prayer and time with Jesus actually look like, to try to catch it. And here's what she says. She says, "What is my spiritual life? A love union with Jesus, in which the divine and the human give themselves completely to one another. All that Jesus asks of me is to give myself to him in all my poverty and nothingness." We can only be like Jesus if we spend time with Jesus. Often, a deep and fervent look at Christ is the best prayer. I look at him, he looks at me. In the silence of the heart, God speaks. If you face God in prayer and silence, God will speak to you. Real prayer is union with God. Isn't that incredible? So simple, right? That's all God's asking of us. Give ourselves, get quiet with him, look at him. He isn't hiding, he wants to be known. And we can know him like that. And as we do it, we will change. In Paul's words in Colossians, he says, now that kind of knowing creates a total renovation of the self. And he actually uses the picture that it's like getting a new wardrobe, but like picking up new pieces of clothing. And in this wardrobe, right, the clothes hanging in this closet, here's what they are: kindness, humility, gentleness, patience, peace, and forgiveness, and love that binds them all together. It's beautiful. And the way we get those clothes in our closet is by deepening our relationship with Christ. The effect of that will be as obvious and evident in our lives as the clothes that we put on. So in our relationship check, then, we can ask ourselves about this. What's hanging in our closets? Do we have that new set of clothes? How would people describe us? Would they describe us as keeping around a few pieces from the old days? Maybe like a gossipy shirt or some lusty pants, greedy shoes. If you're not sure, honestly, ask somebody. Or just imagine what they might say. And if the answer is not what you wished it was, hey, that's okay. It's spring. What better time for cleaning out the closet? So, in order to take the next step in our checkup, we need to consider, why does all this happen? Why does knowing Jesus lead to change? Why would intimacy lead to this compassion and love for others? Well, of course we know it's not magic, right? It's because of what we encounter there. The reason that love starts to leak out of us when we're intimate with Christ is because it's there that you experience the most incredible thing. He loves you. He even likes you. He's pleased with you. He sees every single thing you've done, and even worse, the things you've thought about doing. He sees them and he says, I know it and I forgive you. I give my life for you. And so I will bleed to wash you. And I wash you clean, white as snow. If you've ever in your life had a glimpse of unconditional love from somebody, then you have a little picture of what that kind of love can do for you, right? It fills you and how it actually softens you and it makes you vulnerable and somehow more confident at the same time. And you are able to respond with love. But that's not even a fraction of what comes from knowing Christ. Because when his word of pleasure, you're my beloved son, my beloved daughter, and with you, I'm pleased. When those words pass over us, man, they touch us. And they heal that primal wound that all of us carry, right, of separation. Those words heal and they affirm. And in that, he gives us exactly what your heart has always longed for, what my heart has longed for. He gives you what we're crying for in our hearts and what we've been searching for in all our running and all our habits and all our striving. And once we have the real thing, all that running can stop. And this is how we change. This is how we grow. This is how Christians become like Christ. It's not through willpower or more resolutions that we grow. We bask in a big yes from the one who knows all the worst things that we've ever done. And before we could ever even say we were sorry, he said, I'm coming for you. That's a gift to us. And it's a gift not like any other one ever given. And it's the totally unique thing that Christians have. Our whole confession is that someone actually loved like this. And not just loved generally, but loved specifically you and specifically me like that. Now, God loves everybody outside the church just like that too, right? John says, God so loved the world that he gave his son. But if you don't believe it, that it's true, and you don't embrace it, then you think it's just a story. And although it sounds like a nice idea, nobody's ever actually done it. Nobody's ever actually loved like that, or especially loved me like that. But the reason we come together in church is because we believe that it's actually true, right? And we want to come together and grow to embrace that love better. It's the reality of that love that makes the church what it is and makes us unique in the world. This is actually what John means in a strange passage that we read this morning that says, I'm not writing you a new command, but an old one, which you've had since the beginning. This old command is the message you've heard. Yet I am writing you a new command. Its truth is seen in him and in you. Now, the old command he's talking about is the one to love our neighbor. It's old because it goes back, we've had it since the beginning. It goes all the way back to the earliest of the Old Testament. I'm sure we even heard it in Leviticus. And it's not even limited to the Bible, right? All the major religions of this time and all the philosophies had some kind of basic command to love. Love your neighbors. So John is saying the call to love is old. And so on one hand, you already have it. But on another hand, this call to love like Jesus, the call to love like the love that we've seen poured out in the life of Jesus, and which we, by the way, have actually received, is so radically different than what anybody ever meant or experienced with love that it's actually completely new. Because Jesus said, love one another like I've loved you. No one has greater love than this, to lay down your life for your friends. Jesus has a pretty loose definition of friends, right? He's talking about people who rejected and tortured him. But Jesus is completely redefining all the categories of what love is. And not just with his words, he actually lived it. And when we encounter that, it changes everything. Tim Keller says it like this. He says, if you've seen the truth and believe that somebody left unending joy and was utterly cut off and faced eternal punishment for you, do you realize the love that you're capable of? If you know that, then you've got a model and a motivation and a power and an incentive to love that nobody else has. And God holds you far more responsible for love than anyone else. That's why John is saying that while everybody talks about some version of loving, nobody has this kind of a model and a gift of love that the church does. And that makes the church capable of something that nobody else is. That makes you and me capable of something, of being conduits, being the vessels, the carriers of a love that actually changes lives. And the fact that we've received that gift is good news to us, but it's also good news to others because the gift is meant to be given out to everybody else who doesn't already have it. And I don't know if you've noticed, but it really feels like something's missing in the world. Like Paul says in Romans, if you listen, the world is actually groaning. I haven't always been listening. But for the last 12 years or so, I've been working in doing ministry in the middle of some really painful situations around the world of tragedy, some of the poorest places on the planet, actually. And we've gone into deep connection with extremely vulnerable families in all sorts of contexts. And I'm not saying I'm an expert or that I've seen everything, but in the places where I have been, whether it's the orphan crisis in Africa or the child welfare system here in Saskatoon, at the center of some of the toughest, the most intractable problems of our time, some of the issues that we just seem totally unable to stop or to end these cycles of poverty and violence and trauma, at the very center of those issues, what lies at the heart is the same pain that you and I have in our hearts. There's a loneliness, a fear of rejection, right? A deep cry to be known and to be cared for unconditionally that drives these compulsions and behaviors and cycles that can't be stopped until you deal with the root issue. Now it's tough. I know it's hard. If you've been with addicts or people who've suffered or children who've been rejected and pushed off by the people who were there to receive them, then you know for hurt people, it can be very hard for them to receive love. I've learned it's much easier to provide them a service. It's much harder to be their friend, to enter their lives, to be there when they call. And that's why it so seldom actually happens. But when we do it, guess what happens? Guess what happens to a child that's been abandoned and traumatized and hurt by all those people who were supposed to love you? Guess what happens? And they're on a life track, right, to doing the same thing or even worse to somebody else. Guess what happens when that child, when she finds somebody, gets someone in her life who thinks the world of her, who's pleased with her, who delights in her eyes when she sees the child? Guess what happens? She changes. As Christians, we know this because it's what's happening to us. We know it because we're receiving it. And because we're receiving it, that makes us the ones equipped to do it for others. Now, I'm speaking about traumatized kids and mothers who lose their children because that's the world that I know. So that's why I share it with you. And this morning, there's one boy, 12 years old, in the Congo that's particularly on my mind. His parents were killed. His community was destroyed and attacked. He became a refugee. He had to run. He lived in the bush for months. When I met him, he was so hard, emotionally hard. The wounds had scarred him. The only emotion he could show was panic. At one point, I touched him. Honestly, his heart was racing so fast we thought he was going to pass out. And that was 5 years ago. You know, we intervened in his life. We got him a small house. We got him food, even a little bit of access to reading and writing, but it never broke through. He couldn't learn. He couldn't open up. And so we could keep him alive, but he wasn't healthy. He couldn't build relationships. He was headed for trouble himself. Now, in the meantime, we were also working with a team of local Christians there who wanted to help kids like him. Moyo was his name. Because there were lots of them, lots of these kids. And as we helped to train and equip this little team, we realized, man, they've got tremendous pain in their own lives. And although they all were Christians and they knew Jesus, we started to use this language of, okay, you know Jesus, but do you know the Jesus that I know? They knew Jesus the judge, Jesus the ruler, but we also started to talk about Jesus, the one who comes, the servant, the one who binds up the brokenhearted, the one who gathers the lambs in his arms. And said, all Jesus asks is that we turn to him. And as they started to experience him in their lives, man, I tell you, things started to happen. We don't have time to talk about all that today, but one of the things that happened was the way they reached out to Moyo, the way they embraced him and entered his life. I'm back in Canada now, so I don't get to see him. But 2 weeks ago, I got a photo of him from my friend George, and I tell you, the smile across that boy's face is so big. And I could see in his eyes what's happening. He's changing. He's changing. I'm not saying it's going to be a fairy tale ending for him. I'm not saying these little ragtag groups of Christians that we're building around the world are going to change the toughest orphan crisis we've ever had in history, but I am telling you, something is happening. Something is being touched. And I see the same thing needed in the foster care system here in Canada, in Saskatoon. I see it in seniors' homes just down the road. I see it in my family. These are just examples from my world. They're all over, around me and around you. And what's needed is nothing less than the new command, John's new command. The church is the one who's equipped for it. So we've got to be there, because who else can do it? It doesn't have to be the big headline stuff, right? War zones or foster care, although it might be. But the question for each of us to ask ourselves today is, where's the pain around me? Where's the pain around you? And are you entering it, or are you avoiding it? Do you know someone in that kind of pain that you're getting to know, even as you have been known? For John, that's another spiritual health check, a guide on how deep our relationship is going. Because as it gets deeper, we will be fools in love that run towards pain. That's what we'll be. And just as we've received, we will have something to offer there, even in the toughest places. Now, one last piece from John. He says this: do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, love for the Father is not in them. For everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, comes not from the Father, but from the world. The world and its desires pass away, but whoever does the will of God lives forever. And this is our last check. It comes as a warning about our relationship with the world. And to understand it, we need to notice that this comes in many places in the Bible, and it's very often paired right beside this message to love. We have it here. We have it in John's Gospel in chapter 15. And of course, we have it in the famous command in James. Pure and genuine religion in the sight of God the Father means caring for orphans and widows in their distress and refusing to let the world corrupt you. So why? Why are they so often paired together? Okay, well, follow me for a minute here, okay? Earlier this morning, we heard John talking about hating our brother and sister. He said it's impossible to hate your brother and sister if you have the light of Christ. Now, when we hear that, most of us kind of remove ourselves from that because we don't consider ourselves haters. But to hear what John actually means, we've got to remember, Jesus redefined all that stuff. He said hate, anger, murder, it's all wrapped up together. And he included in there calling our brother Raka, which means a nobody, right? It literally means a nobody. It means pushing someone out, saying to them, you nobody, you're nothing to me. You mean nothing to me. My heart does not go out to you. Now that we can call apathy. And that feels more familiar because apathy happens to us, all of us. We encounter pain or need, or someone comes to us and we are not moved. Our hearts just don't go out to them. Now that happens when our hearts are captured by something else. John says that's the world. It's love of the world. And when our hearts are captured by love of the world, there just isn't room for anything else to grow there. We stop hearing the cries around us. We can even become dull to the cries inside us that need to be known. So John is saying, be careful. Be careful. That's how he wraps this up. Be careful of what the world offers you. Be careful how much you delight in it, because you can't have both love of the world and love of God. No matter how much you try to rationalize it, when you have one, you will feel like you don't need the other. Now, John is not saying the world is bad. He's not. Consistently through the Bible, we know God created the world, and he repeatedly affirms it as good. So food, sleep, leisure, sex, comfort, art, jobs, whatever, all of them are good, and the Bible does not talk about rejecting them. The problem comes when we elevate any single one of them to be more than good, to become the thing that we work for and live for and dream of. When it becomes the thing, I think, if I could just get a little bit of that, or a little bit more of that, or a different version of that, then I'll finally have peace in my heart. That's when we cross the line. and we overfill. And that will crowd out our relationship with Jesus and that path to relationship to love the world. So as we finish our health checks this morning, we can check, how are we doing with that? How much of our time, our daydreaming, our money, ourselves is spent on the world? And how much is spent on the banquet of things and people that can never repay us? Not because the world is bad, but because there's something so much better available. And because the world is groaning, ready for it. That's why we want to be a community that encourages one another to be brave enough to become vulnerable and to ask ourselves the questions and to do the checks that lead to life, abundant life for us and for everybody around us. That's why we do this. And so now let's end. We'll end as John ends the chapter. He says this, "Now, children, stay with Christ. Live deeply in Christ. Then we'll be ready for him when he appears, ready to receive him with open arms, confident and unashamed before him at his coming."